It's November 2023, and there's been a lot of talk on social media and mainstream media about the New York State government's ability to involuntarily quarantine New Yorkers. Unfortunately, I know a lot about this situation, so I'm making this video for educational purposes. Here's a clip from January 2022. Is New York Governor Hochul working behind the scenes to pass a concentration camp law here in New York State? This video is divided into 3 parts: the history of this situation, part 2, the court challenges, and part 3, just my comments. In 2019, I was working in Manhattan and raising my 4 children. In June of 2019, the 2 of my kids who were under 18 were kicked out of school due to the forced vaccination law. According to New York state law, children must get 72 doses of 16 shots in order to attend school. Tens of thousands of New York kids were kicked out of school, and many of their families moved out of state. I believe in parental choice, but I had done extensive research on shots, and I was outraged that my kids were being denied an education because I refused to poison them. I became friends with a group of moms, and we were all homeschooling together. One of the moms told me about the proposed Bill A99, which later became A416. That mom was like, if that bill becomes a law, we are leaving the state immediately. We're not even going to pack up our things. In New York State, for a proposed bill to become a law, the bill must have a sponsor in the Senate, an S number, a sponsor in the Assembly, or an A number. The bill must go through a process symbolized by these dots and ultimately be signed by the governor. This bill that became a law that we are looking at is the forced vaccination law. Here is the proposed bill that totally freaked out my friend. It was originally proposed in 2015. Every 2 years, a bill, if it does not become a law, gets a new number, and there was no sponsor in the Senate, so it had no chance of becoming a law. But it did not matter because the wording of the bill was so alarming that it just wigged out New Yorkers. Here's a summary. For the last 6 years, there had been a bill on the books, A416. This bill, had it become law, would give government officials the authority to indefinitely detain New Yorkers without due process, and detainees would be required to submit to any medical procedure the state deemed necessary. So there was a good deal of public outrage about this proposed bill, and here are some headlines from 2021. On December 20th, 2021, the bill was withdrawn by its sponsor, Assemblyman Nick Perry. The reason Perry gave was, quote, to deprive these individuals or conspiracy theorists the ability to use this issue for fuel to spread their fire of lies and mistruths. So back to 2019 when my kids were kicked out of school. So I became an activist, and one of the things I found out was that they were giving deadly shots to kids at school without parental knowledge or consent. And I said, oh my gosh, that's so evil. That's terrible. So that's actually why I ran for office. And long story short, the way that they were able to do that was Governor Cuomo simply wrote it into the Department of Health regulations. No voting or anything. So it was December 2021, Christmas time, and everyone was angry at Nick Perry about this terrible bill. So he said, fine, I'll take off the bill. And then everyone was happy, and it was Christmas time, right? Yay. Except the governor and the Department of Health were like the Grinch, and they just took that proposed bill and they just put it into the Department of Health regulations, totally circumventing the legislative process. So in January 2022, no one knew about this, so I was posting about it quite a lot on social media. I did a video analyzing the language of the Department of Health regulation. It was almost the exact same thing as Perry's bill. It's so dystopian, it's absolutely beyond words. For purposes of brevity, I'm not including the whole video, but you can screenshot to look at my comments. As noted here, the diagnostic test for COVID-19, the PCR test, was recalled in a Class 1 recall by the FDA. So if the diagnostic test for COVID-19 was not valid, doesn't that call into question the entire pandemic? And here, officials can declare that your belongings have COVID cooties and confiscate your assets. Of course, this dystopian Department of Health regulation was challenged in the courts, bringing us to part 2. This legal challenge was taken on by the attorney Bobby Ann Cox, assisted by Unifying New York State. While Bobby Ann Cox is a competent attorney, the judge ultimately sided with Hochul, hence the outrage this past week. Bringing us to part 3, my comments. I'm not an attorney. Please pause the video to read this legal notice. One could argue that the core controversy here is more of a medical issue than a legal one. From the American Medical Association's Code of Medical Ethics, the ethical use of quarantine and isolation, quote, support mandatory quarantine and isolation when a patient fails to adhere voluntarily. Here's a video I made in October of 2020 asking questions about this AMA ethical code. What are the ethical considerations for physicians in light of the fact that the New York State government has created unconstitutional laws that violate basic human rights, including involuntarily placing citizens in quote-unquote isolation facilities? In response to the serious medical situation that plagued New York in March of 2020, the New York State Senate and Assembly passed the bill S7919, which allows New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo the ability to pass, quote, any directive necessary to respond to a state disaster emergency. S7919 gives Cuomo the power to force individuals and groups to involuntarily quarantine. In the American Medical Association's Principles of Medical Ethics, Section 8.4d states, quote, with respect to the use of quarantine and isolation as public health interventions in situations of epidemic disease, individual physicians should support mandatory quarantine and isolation when a patient fails to adhere voluntarily. My question to physicians is this, and please pass this on to the physicians that you know. What are your thoughts on this? When do you think it's appropriate to drag someone involuntarily from their home and make them quarantine for 2 weeks? The AMA makes no mention of children. What about them? Are you familiar with other episodes in history where the government has lied to their people and subsequently done bad things to them? Clearly, the powers that be are not done with medical tyranny. Generally speaking, doctors did not stand with their patients during COVID, round 1. Question, will there be consequences for doctors if they do not stand with their patients in round 2? I have a confession to make. I really did not want to make this video, and here's the reason. Government officials are maintaining they have property rights over Americans. It's nonsense. We own ourselves. We have property rights over our own bodies. Through masking, contact tracing, and mandates, the government is effectively treating Americans like farm animals. Silence is consent, so if New Yorkers are not speaking out, they're embracing this farm animal existence, and that's their choice. So why are New Yorkers upset about involuntary quarantining? They did it voluntarily with contact tracing. They even comply with contact tracing for their children. In the summer of 2020, I did a video about it. Presented the interim COVID-19 guidance for schools. And these guidelines will determine how New York State's 688 school districts will reopen, as well as a formula to ascertain if schools can reopen at all. But I want to address with you the most critical issues I feel that are presented in the guidelines. Okay, number 3, contact tracing. Cuomo breezed through this topic at the July 13th press conference. All he said is, quote, tracing has to work in the schools. That's all he said. So here is what Cuomo said about contact tracing. As part of the strategy to reopen, we will use contact tracing to limit the spread of the virus and implement a phased return to a new normal. Cuomo described the test, trace, isolate process in detail. He said, quote, how does it work? You test a person for COVID-19. If the person winds up positive, then you trace that person's contacts. Contacts are people, this is me talking, contacts are people that you've been in close physical proximity to, like family or coworkers, or even someone at the supermarket or a hair salon. And this information is found via an app on your phone, and which tracks your location, shares this information and your medical status with the government. So Cuomo continued, quote, for every positive person identified, you have to go back and trace. Once you trace and you find more people who test positive, then you isolate them. They are under quarantine. They can't go out. They can't infect anyone else. So there will be these quote-unquote isolation facilities for people who test positive for COVID-19 and who cannot self-isolate. He went on to say, quote, we have put together a tracing army. Former Mayor Bloomberg has volunteered to help develop the program, which will recruit, hire, and train 17,000 tracers statewide. Okay, so question number 1. If a student who participates in contact tracing comes into contact repeatedly with infected people several times over the course of a year, how will this impact his or her education plan? Number 2, quarantining necessitates that the individual has his or her own separate bathroom. What if a child tests positive? The family only has one bathroom, but more than one child. What happens? Question 3, what about teachers who are tested, traced, and tracked and forced to self-quarantine? Will there be enough substitute teachers available? Question 4, if the person who tests positive has no symptoms, they're asymptomatic, they feel fine, they're healthy, are they still required to self-isolate? And most importantly, what if they don't want to? What if they don't want to quarantine? What happens? May 2020 post. Contact tracing is a test. Government officials will only do what the people will tolerate. Instead of uniting and telling government officials where to shove it with this dystopian contact tracing, the people generally complied. Here is the proposed federal law H.R. 6666 to conduct diagnostic testing for COVID-19 and for other purposes. For other purposes. That can literally mean anything. If a law is vague, it is extremely dangerous because it can be interpreted in many ways. Laws need to be specific. It is the gray areas wherein your liberties can be taken away. So should people be like my fearful New York friend and leave the state? Of course, people should move if they want to move, but some things to consider. If you are planning to leave New York because of this, sadly, there are also problematic laws at the federal level, and I've done posts about this. I'm not a tax expert, but if you have assets and you bolt out of the state, there could be serious tax consequences. It's really sad when you're a good person and you just want to live your life, but then you realize there's some very problematic things that are going on behind the scenes. In New York, we had 9/11, we had the forced shot law in 2019, we had COVID, we had the proposed A416 from Perry. In my opinion, these are all tactics of the powers that be to encourage their opposition to leave the state. Moving is exactly what these people want you to do because A, it's expensive, and B, generally speaking, you don't have ties in a new community. I believe that they want to slavify, if that's a verb, slavify New York. Another thing to consider is that once you are cognizant of the technological abilities of the powers that be, you become aware of the fact that moving might not be the best idea. Some of this ties into the pinned video that I have about James Traficant, the late Ohio congressman. James Traficant spoke a lot of truth, and one of the things he used to talk about was how the government is not what we think it is, how the courts also are not what we think they are, and also how the government views us as human beings is not what we think either. When I was growing up as a kid, we had a next door neighbor and both of our properties had a little bit of woods in the back. He did not want us playing behind his house. So you know what he did? He told us that he had bear traps back there behind his property. He basically was using fear to achieve his goal. Were there bear traps back there? I don't know, but I knew one thing. He was not a good person. It's a pretty similar situation. Like, first of all, where are these quarantine camps? I don't even know where they are. And second of all, one thing you should take away from all this is that our government officials are not good people and to prepare accordingly. My good friend used to say fear is an acronym, FEAR, face everything and rise. This is a psychological war and they're using fear as a weapon. Fear is your enemy and critical thinking is your friend. So I'm still working on my website. I know it's a long story, elizabethglass.org, and I hope to see you over there soon. Thanks so much.